morning. Welcome back to Bold TV. Unfortunately, Clay is out again. He'll be back soon. But in the meantime, we've got the lovely Julia Sun with us today. Good morning, Julia.
Good morning, Carrie.
And we're so glad to have you all here. We got a great show. Michael Steele, the former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland and the former Republican National Committee Chairman, is with us today to talk about those CPAC comments made last week. We got a lot going on. Make sure to put your comments and questions. We love integrating them into the show, so make sure you put them in. Let us know what you think.
And also joining us today is Nomiki Konst. She's a correspondent at the Young Turks. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, guys. Good morning. I love this new studio. Last time I was with you guys, it was in a different space. It's beautiful.
Yes. Well, we love having you here, as always.
Come back soon.
Already? I haven't even said anything yet. Be careful.
Yeah, well, we have a clip from a discussion that we had earlier this week, and I'm just going to roll it just so our viewers know what Nomiki and I talked a little bit about with Ivanka this week. And so I'll give Nomiki a chance because we didn't get to continue it. So I'm going to play what I said, and then I want you to respond because we didn't get to finish what we were saying.
Very meta here.
It is, yes. Well, I've definitely changed my Twitter bio pretty much every week, maybe. And I think and that's the beauty of Ivanka, is that she has many roles. Her book that just most recently came out about working women, I think is an inspiration. And as someone who is a small business owner myself, I am so proud to see that she has stood up for small business owners such as myself through tax reform. I think she's been a tremendous advocate for women. And it's really sad to see that women are not backing her up. And it's a double standard to see how so many women are attacking her rather than trying to give her just a chance to shine and to use her platform to help women. She's helping women of color as well every day, which she's doing not only with business but also with STEM and trying to get more women of color into STEM. She is a champion and she is a role model for women everywhere. So, Nomiki, it's March, it's Women's Month, so, and I know you said that she's just a mouthpiece of the administration, so therefore we gotta hold her to the same standard. But just at a human level, and like woman to woman, doesn't she deserve any sort of ability to just speak, and say, I am interested in empowering women? Do you think she is interested in empowering women?
I think on a personal level she is, but often personal, as we know from feminism, can conflict with the public. And she has an official role. She may or may not have a security clearance. That's another subject matter. She's also being investigated by the FBI, likely. So this is somebody who does hold an administration position. She has an office in the White House. She's a representative of her father, but she can't choose what role she wants to take when it's convenient to get out of something that she said. And I think that's the complication of this, is that she was saying, that's my father. I don't want to comment on the Me Too scandals of my father, because ultimately, as a woman, that would be the most empowering thing, is to say, you know what? He is my father, but what he did or may have done is wrong. And I stand with any woman if this is indeed true.
Well, and that's what she said during the Golden Globes and we're going to talk more about that later in the show, which you need to put your comments, where she tweeted out in response to what Oprah said, go Oprah, I agree with your comment. So she has made these statements.
Except ... for her father.
Well, as we talked about in the show, there's been no conviction. And a lot of these accusations pretty much, were there any that came out before he started running for president?
There was some. I know that there were some lawsuits that, obviously there's a lot of NDAs, but later, I know during the campaign, and I don't want to misquote this, but during the campaign, NPR did this whole series on previous lawsuits, and I don't know if they were unsealed before the campaign and just hadn't been reported on, or they were unsealed during the campaign, but there was a limitation after the lawsuits had been.
Well, let's find out more on that, and we'll talk about that more later. But I also want to get your take on what's happening with the Dow. So we saw the Dow dropping 500 points, basically in response. There was a headline this week about this, in response to the sanctions of President Trump's announcement of steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs. So I'm one of those free market advocates. I was disappointed to see the announcement of the tariffs. And what the president said in response was, he said, when we're 100 billion down with a certain country and they get cute, don't trade anymore and we win big. So I think what he's trying to say is that he wants to discourage companies from being taken advantage of or continuing to trade with a large deficit. And so he's hoping to reduce deficits, and by planting his flag in the ground, he's hoping the other countries will respond and reduce their tariffs. So I don't know. What's your take?
I think you're giving him a lot of credit.
I mean, look, as I said, I'm skeptical. I think in some ways it reminds me of President Nixon's price controls that he put on in the 70s that failed. And so, I mean, I want this president to succeed. I absolutely do. I just think all the evidence at this point, and that's why Gary Cohn, who's one of his senior economic advisors, there's been some word on the street that he might be leaving in light of this. So, but Nomiki, what's your take on this? I mean, because the thing is that some of what he says, his economic populism, the left has been embraced in terms of unions and wanting to do protectionist around American industry.
If he were somebody that truly did believe in fair trade, he would be embracing unions. You can't just say fair trade and then not be union. He's in this no man's land where he has economic advisors around him, and I don't actually think he believes in fair trade. I mean, there's no evidence whatsoever in his history that he believes in fair trade or progressive, a progressive take on trade. I think that he is really struggling with the populism that he ran on and what he truly believes and what his advisors believe. And it's someone who says the stock market's better than ever and then has had 3 plunges in the last month. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes in the White House. I don't know what his perspective is on economics. So it's really hard for me to comment on it. But all I'll say is if he did believe in these things and the left really did agree with him on this, I think he should back it up with supporting the rights for workers and workers to organize and actually investing in communities and raising the minimum wage. And I could go through a laundry list of issues that would back up what I think most people on the progressive side believe is fair trade.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is both Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump, they just cherry pick whatever is inconvenient for them at the moment. So we actually have a comment from Melissa Bands, and she says, no, we can't back her, Ivanka, up, helping women, as advisor to her dad. We expect more. Sorry, no milk. She can't have it all.
And we've got, on the other side, Rob Morero says, other countries have to be fair. So, and he also says, finally, we have a president who is fighting for America's interest. So I think the jury will be out. Rob, I'm very curious. I would love to see if these tariffs have the intended effect. Based on historical evidence, I'm not so sure that would work. Although I will say, when he said he was putting tariffs on solar panels, we actually did see some Chinese companies say, we're going to build plants in America in response, which I found fascinating. And I was like, wow, that actually worked. Yeah. So we'll see. The jury's out right now. One last comment that we want to get from you about what's happening with the guns. So Walmart announced, and also Dick's Sporting Goods both announced that they would put an age limit or a mandate to say 21 or above only in terms of being allowed to buy a firearm. I like to see private companies taking action. I don't like mandates, and so is this a win-win with a left-right perspective for you?
Maybe. It would be. I think that from the left's perspective, we have a deadlock in Washington right now, pretty much on everything. So to have leadership that would be able to boldly take these initiatives before, it had to be left to business would be great. I mean, that's what we elect them for. That's what we pay them their salaries every year. But the problem is that the lobbies are so strong. The counter lobby is the business community. I mean, I never in a million years would have thought that Walmart would take an action like that, or Dick's Sporting Goods. It can also have a reverse side effect. If you look at other issues, you could have a sudden far-right extremist, response, and they say they're not going to Walmart anymore or Dick's Sporting Goods. So I think the question is in leadership. It always ends with leadership. Who's the leader of Walmart? What are they willing to side with at this moment? Shame's a powerful tool. And the way that those kids from Parkland have been able to step up and shame their leaders, I think by default, it shames these companies as well. They don't want to be aligned with the leaders that are being embarrassed right now, literally on stage by 16 and 17-year-olds.
So I guess if you look at the shootings that took place, at Orlando Pulse, out in California, just most of these shootings are actually done by people who are above 21. A lot are mass shootings. Some of the school shootings are done by teenagers, but I'm not convinced necessarily that putting this age restriction would stop a lot of other shootings, in the sense that most guns are actually obtained illegally when crime is committed. So the Wall Street Journal reported on a study that said only 11%, it was a federal study, only 11% of gun crimes occur with guns that are purchased legally, which means that the vast majority of gun crimes are committed by guns that are floating out there illegally. So it seems to me that that's a failure by law enforcement to control illegal arms.
Well, I think there's something really important to keep in mind, which is a piece of data that's missing, the data. They're basing this off of really bad data. The NRA lobbied 20 years ago to stop the federal government from actually researching gun crimes. So we're lumping together, a mass shooting is shooting more than 2 people, right? That's how it's many say is diagnosed. So what's the difference between shooting 2 people in a home in a domestic violence incident and a mass shooting? When it comes to school shootings, when it comes to these I hate to say it this way, but over 5 people being shot, it really does come down to youth. There is data behind violence and extremism with those under the age of 22, males under the age of 22. That goes back to the mental health issue. I don't think it's an either or situation. I think it's a both situation. If we invested in Medicare for all, we would probably have better mental health standards in our country and help for people who are hurting. Don't forget, there's a laundry list of issues that are attached to this, but I think in terms of citing these studies, we have to be really, really careful about how we're citing them because there's so little research.
So then what about the University of Chicago saying only 3% of gun crimes are committed by legally purchased guns in the city of Chicago? Are you saying the University of Chicago is not legitimate?
No, I'm not saying the University of Chicago is not legitimate. I'm saying that the research, when the data is not being produced for these universities and these newspapers to cite, it's flawed. It's coming from the basis. And I think all of these newspapers should say things like, P.S., there's no data because the NRA had blocked the government from actually researching gun violence. They lobbied for that. So, in Chicago, it's an extreme situation. What we see in Chicago is that there is a flood of guns coming from the borders where there are weaker gun laws. The gun laws in Chicago and in Illinois are stronger, but it is an exception to the norm, which is in areas where there are tighter gun laws, there is lower gun violence. Bottom line, anywhere on the map except for maybe 2 places because of an inflow from neighboring states.
Well, I think we all can agree we want to stop the inflow of illegal arms from other countries.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah,
let's
not everybody can agree. So I like that we all agree here at this table.
Great. Well, we're going to leave right there then on that note of agreement. Thanks.
No Hope Hicks? Come on. I had all these Hope Hicks jokes.
Oh.
Just kidding.
Oh, what? Okay.
No, there's no jokes. I'm just kidding.
Well, that means you're just going to have to come back.
Okay,
Yeah,
sounds
we'll have
good.
you back next
I don't think the drama will end anytime soon.
Yeah. No, we got to move on because we've got waiting on Skype with us. And thanks, Nobika, for joining us. We've got former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland and the former Republican National Convention Chairman Michael Steele here on Skype. You there? Good morning, Michael.
I'm here. How's it going?
Hey, good morning.
Hi. Good morning. And Nomika says hi too. So good to have you here with us. And we are going to play that for those who don't know about what happened at CPAC last week, the Conservative Political Action Conference. We're going to roll that tape of what was said by the communications director for CPAC.
We had just elected the first African-American president, and that was a big deal. And that was a hill that we got over, and it was something that we were all proud of. And we weren't sure what to do. And a little bit of cynicism, what do? This is a terrible thing. We elected Mike Steele to be the RNC chair because he's a black guy. That was the wrong thing to do.
And Michael, why do you think he said what he said?
I don't know. I think he just had a moment of stupid. It's the only thing I can think of because I don't know why I would come up at a CPAC conference 8 years after my chairmanship. I was there doing my radio show for Sirius XM. I've been a friend of CPAC. I've spoken at CPAC. So this really came out of left field. I have a sense or a feel that it was a little bit contrived, a little bit orchestrated. I've been very critical of the way a lot of this administration has unfolded over the past a year and a half. And that was the first spot that, Matt Slapp, the chairman of CPAC, went to when he came on my radio show the next day to explain himself. So the reality for me is an organization that invites a Le Pen, that has, it's one of its officers stand up before a dinner and make a racist statement, seems to want to get into bed with that kind of vile form of racism. And it's surprising to me because it's not something that I thought the organization or the individuals would go to. But we live in a different age and a different time. We have a president who's given quarter to a lot of that. And I think for their very selfish reasons and maybe even self-preservation or just wanting to be liked by the president, they felt they had to go there.
So Ian Walters, as I understand it, he's Latino, correct?
I believe, yeah.
Yeah. So and he wrote an op-ed in the Hill newspaper talking about. We'll put that up on screen so folks can read the response of what he said. So the headline is, "Talking about race isn't racist." So what he said in the piece is basically, and I want to get your take on this, Michael, because in some ways I thought of Clarence Thomas when he said, "The worst forms of racial discrimination in this nation have always been accompanied by straight-faced representations that discrimination helped minorities," i.e., it's a critique of affirmative action, that Clarence Thomas is very critical of affirmative action. Do you think that was the lens that Ian Walters was looking at this situation? Because it seems that was his defense.
Yeah, I don't think Ian has a lens on this at all. I think he's gotten gobsmacked by all of this. He stepped into this particular viper pit very unprepared. He sounded stupid in standing in front of the office and audience, and he sounded even more stupid in print. Making these sort of lame excuses for what he said doesn't change the underlying thing of what he said. We can talk about race without being racist, but when you start with a racist comment, hello, we don't. You take us where you say you don't need to go. So. I think that they just need to be honest about this. They're not being honest about it, and it's very disappointing. It is very immature, and I think they've exposed themselves. CPAC has had its issues over the last few years under Matt's leadership. There's no doubt about that. The controversies in people attending, the lack of really well-regarded Republicans coming and participating as they once did. Rand Paul wasn't even there this year, and as weren't a lot of others from the Hill, from around Washington. So their cachet has clearly been on the decline under Matt's leadership, and that's unfortunate because it has a very strong history and a very good history up till now. The other thing, though, I want to touch on, which I found the most galling, was Matt looking me in the eye and saying that I had to be graceful about this, that I had to be, basically, remember your place. Remember, you should be appreciative of what I don't know. But that to me was not only the most galling, but probably the most asinine comment to make.
I think what struck me about what he had said, and you and I are both fans of what CPAC represents in terms of a place for conservatives to get together. But I was disappointed when he had said, well, it's because you criticized President Trump that these comments were made. And I just, the way that they were described, I think I found troubling as well. And also in reading Ian Walters' response, he said the RNC took a risk on someone without the usual managerial experience that the job requires. I found that strange because you'd been the lieutenant governor of a state.
Yeah,
so I'm not sure what other sort of managerial experience he was wanting, except for maybe governor or president. But I've never heard of a president who had gone on to then be RNC director after leaving the presidency.
Right. Well, see, that again shows just how ass backwards it all was. I mean, he just sounded, you can't describe it anything other as just dumb. It's just stupid. I was a county chairman. I was a state chairman. I was lieutenant governor. I was the chairman of GOPAC, founded by Newt Gingrich. So, okay, I don't have the qualifications to be chairman of the RNC. Maybe Ian does. But here's the question for Ian. How'd you get your job?
Well, so, and then what he said...
So why did they hire you?
Well, Julie's got a question here.
Well, I only have one question for you. It's very straight and simple. Michael, do you think the Republican Party these days still got a racism problem?
Yeah, they do have a problem with race. They don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how to deal with it when they have to confront it. And if they think they're going to make any headways in communities of color around this country, they better get their act together on that. I tried. We moved into a different space. We elected a cross section of candidates across the country, from a Hispanic governor to an African American congressman, and everything in between. So we we spent a great deal of time being on the ground and listening to people and understanding the very important way in which you have a conversation by being honest and addressing the things that they're concerned about. When you start off with the kind of rhetoric that we've heard from the very beginning of the presidential primary in 2015 to shithole countries just a month ago, that says to a broader community of people, including, I might say, white folks, who do not countenance this kind of attitude or view or language. It puts everybody in a position where they say, you're not serious. Not only you're not serious, you're not ready to have a conversation with us. You're not ready for our vote. So,
yeah, well, Michael, I agree with you that conservatives, Republicans really need to do so much more. And in fact, Richard Ivory, who used to work for you, is and he founded the blog Hip Hop Republican after he worked for you. He's one of our good friends of the show here at Bold. But I wanted to give you a chance to respond to what Ian also said in his op-ed. He said that while you were chairman, that you promoted your book instead of the RNC, you allowed your staff to expense trips to strip clubs, and you had some cronies set up shop in Tampa. So what would you say in response to those charges where he is questioning what you did as a leader?
Well, that is the narrative that was created around my chairmanship to undermine my efforts to be chairman, to be quite honest about it. Look, the bottom line is, the Florida thing, I didn't set up my crony in Florida. She was down there working to prepare for the national convention, which we had decided would be in Tampa. And the Tampa Convention Center put her up so she could do her early groundwork on there in Florida. To the strip club, that is such bull, because the fact of the matter is I didn't authorize it. In fact, the young woman who spent the money on our credit card was fired the day I found out about it. We got reimbursed by the folks who were with her. And that, again, was just a narrative like I somehow was there and had control over that. I was 3,000 miles away at our winter meeting in Hawaii while that was taking place in California. It was not authorized by me. And then, again, what was the first one?
Promoting your book.
Instead
of the RNC.
Yeah, I wrote a book before I became chairman in which I laid out the blueprint for how we would defeat the Obama agenda, how we would rebuild ourselves and rebrand ourselves as an RNC. I wrote that book not even thinking I would be chairman, not intending to run as chairman, and I just made it available to people. Just like senators write books and other chairmen have written books. I believe one of my predecessors wrote a book while he was in office. I wrote my book before I got there. So this is the kind of, if this is all they got, bring it, baby. Just bring it. All right?
Sure.
I got 63 House seats.
Right. No, the 2010 results, I think, speak for themselves. And I don't know if you remember, but I first met you in 2009. You had lots of people around you at the Harvard Kennedy School because you came to speak. And I got to say, there are a lot of my classmates who were very liberal who were very intrigued by your message. So I think it's definitely the conservative movement needs people like you. And one last question for you about our friend John Levine, who's a media reporter, pointed out that Joe Scarborough had basically made similar comments as Ian Walters about 10 years ago. And you clearly, have patched things up with him. So are you able, first of all, how are you able to forgive Joe Scarborough, and are you willing to forgive Ian?
I was unaware of that. I was not aware of that at the time. Don't remember it. I honest to God, don't remember it at the time. That happened. There was so much going on. I was, chairman at the time. I don't think that was something that was brought to my attention. So I'd have to go back and review that. Number one. Number two, look, I'm all about patching up. I don't like this rift in the party. I don't like the dissension within the party. I joined the party a long time ago and have been in a constant fight both within and without the party, outside the party, trying to adhere to some core principles and values that I think matter to people and I believe still matter today. So that's the fight I want to have. So if Matt Schlapp and Ian Walters or anybody else wants to pick a fight with me, I'm ready, baby. I can go down with the best of them. Trust me. You wanna dance? Let's dance. But you have to ask yourself when you're sitting there battered and bruised on the floor and I'm standing on your throat, was it worth it? Because for me, the fight is bigger than you. The fight is how we save this country, move it forward.
Those are some Trumpian comments there.
Well,
those are fighting words. I wouldn't mess with you.
You know what the difference is? I want everybody in this fight. I want everybody fighting for America, not fighting against each other, not being suspicious because of the color of their skin, not building walls to keep them out, not tearing down communities of color or any community because they don't look, sound, or live where you live. So I think we have a lot of work still to do, and I hope there are a lot of Republicans out there, whatever your stripe, conservative, moderate, jujitsu, whatever. If you're ready to uphold the Republican principles that drew you to the party in the first place, that's what we should be about.
All right, Michael, I have to leave it at that spot. Wish we had more time, but we'll continue the conversation another time, all right?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great. So, the Oscars are coming up on Sunday, and do you think that Hollywood is going to use the platform to showcase the Me Too movement the way they did at the Golden Globes? Put your thoughts, comments. We will put them here into the conversation with HuffPost Alanna Vagianos. Did I say that right? You did. Excellent. And Newsweek's Marie Solis. Welcome, Alanna and Marie.
Yeah, welcome to the show. And do you guys think the Me Too and the Time's Up movement have the same strength now compared to the beginning of the award season?
I mean, unfortunately, no. I think that, there was such a momentum in the beginning, and of course, we're going to lose steam along the way. I'm hoping that, the momentum keeps up, especially since the Oscars are the largest and kind of most viewed award show. So, we'll see, but I definitely think that momentum has slowed.
Yeah, I agree with Alanna. I do think that it would be a mistake to kind of, at the front of this movement, when it was just getting started, we were kind of measuring momentum by how many men were getting outed a week and how many men were losing their jobs. And that's just not a way that we want to measure the movement. And I think that the movement can still be really powerful and work in a lot of different covert ways and yeah, keep
well,
its
what
momentum.
would you say is a good way to measure it? Because in the beginning, yes, how many many men were outed this week over, sexual misconduct, so on and so forth. But eventually, other men became so alert, and I've read at many places that some men nowadays, they're less likely to hire a female intern. They're less likely to mentor young female employees, and that's not good for anybody.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do, however, think that those kinds of reports that we're seeing are a little overblown. I've had a lot of conversations with men about this movement and what it means to them, and I think that a lot of men are willing to step up, and they do understand that they have a role to play in this, and they're willing to support and uplift their female colleagues and the women in their lives, and that's not a main concern of mine in terms of sustaining the movement.
I also do think, to go off of that, it's an unfortunate truth. I do believe that that's happening. There's a ripple effect kind of in both ways, in a good way and a bad way. That's definitely part of it. I think a reckoning as large and seismic as this, there's going to be some things that happen like that where, some men in certain fields believe that they shouldn't be hiring or mentoring young women. And I think it's one of those just unfortunate truths. We got to take a little bad with the big good, and make sure we can, take proactive, impactful steps for our next steps. So
I always find this conversation so interesting as someone who was raised in a very, very conservative culture, where the comments that were made by somebody like Mike Pence, where he said, I'm not alone with a woman who's not my wife. I found that to be very, just in line with the way I was raised, very conservative, to say, look, let's just not even approach that line. So so it seems like that Hollywood has created film where women are hypersexualized. There's a lot of music in the music industry where women are, in my opinion, exploited and hypersexualized. So, like, how is it that what Mike Pence says it was ridiculed when, in some respects, I think it's a way of making sure that there's no question that there's something problematic happening?
Well, first off, I think it's wildly problematic that Mike Pence can't be in a room with a woman who's not his wife, because it actually denotes the idea that women are only here to be sexual objects, right? Why wouldn't you be in a room with a coworker who's a female? You know, I think, in my opinion,
But I think he said like going in a social, like going to dinner or something like that with a female who's not his wife. Yeah.
Well, I mean, clients go out to work go out to dinner all the time. You know, coworkers go out to a bar all the time. It's usually mixed genders. So I think that right there is actually the real issue. And of course, we live in a culture that over-sexualizes and objectifies women's bodies. That's certainly part of the issue. I think that's part of systemic issues and how, rape culture actually exists. I think by pointing out problematic statements like Vice President Pence's, that's a start to kind of dismantle a culture that objectifies women.
Well, you reported in HuffPost that about 94% of women have been sexually harassed and or assaulted. And now everybody, or almost everybody, is trying to speak up. But a lot of people we've been talking to say that, someday we're going to start tuning out of this message.
Right. Well, and so that's my question is, I think isn't there a big difference between harassment versus assault? I mean, to say
definitely.
the 94% headline, to me, seems like that's lumping it all together. Like, do you think that risks by having a headline where it's 94% saying, this, like, we have to differentiate here?
Totally. Well, first off, I completely agree, and that language is so important. And I think it's something that, as reporters, we need to take that responsibility on. The specific language, harassment, sexual misconduct, assault, all these things have been lumped together. And that's a problem. But I will say that the 94% was just in Hollywood, and that was actually just harassment. That's not assault. Harassment and assault are different. I think that there is obviously, it gets to be very hard. Sexual violence falls on a spectrum. You have everything from a weird comment, that a sexual comment with a coworker, to assault and rape. So of course, I think that right now we're sifting through and grappling with how do we discuss this in a language and the vocabulary that people who may not have, this type of, gender studies, theology, like know all of these terms, how do we discuss it with the larger public?
So basically you're saying, according to what 94% of women in Hollywood have been assaulted, have been sexually harassed, and then there are some others who have been assaulted. So
Yes,
the number is
definitely.
basically closer to 100% than we think.
Definitely, and that's, of course, just for this one survey. There was, I want to say off the top of my head, 1,500 respondents. Okay. So, of course, it's out of that one group, but yes, it speaks to a larger issue.
So in terms of, and we got to wrap the segment, but thank you, ladies, both for being here. In terms of, looking at the relationship between conservatives and Hollywood, a lot of conservatives would say, well, Hollywood doesn't represent me. I don't see myself on the big screen. There are a lot of people of faith who feel like they're mocked in Hollywood. And then when they see the Me Too movement, a lot of people think of it now that it's almost crossing the line that what's happened, in my opinion, as a conservative, sometimes I see people, they say, well, if I believe in Me Too, then I have to believe in all these other liberal policies, and do you think that you risk alienating some conservative women who might be on your side to say, this is just, I can support empowering women, but then when you want to take it to the next level and say, therefore, you need, these socialist or government intervention programs, that's, to me, it seems it's conflating the issue. Do you think there's any risk of that?
I think we kind of need to kind of look at who it is exactly who is making this movement politically divisive. We have a president who himself has been accused of sexual assault and harassment, and he's been willing to point to Democrats who have been accused of the same thing and saying, I believe the women who are speaking out against Al Franken. But when it comes to someone like Roy Moore, he's saying, I'm going to stick with Roy Moore. So you have a lot of, and it's not just the president, of course, you have a lot of different kind of political players who are making this an issue of right or left. And the fact is, sexual harassment, sexual assault, it happens to people no matter their political orientation. And, I think for me, there is a political underpinning to the Me Too movement in that, for me, I see it as a part of the feminist movement, which can't be sanitized of its politics. However, I think that there is a way for women and people who have found themselves to be victims of different sexual abuses to really, come together and it doesn't have to be politically divisive. There is a way to unite people around the cause of eliminating sexual violence from our culture. And I think that there's no one who would disagree with that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you
today,
for having
ladies,
us. Thank you so
Alanna
much.
and Marie. We have to move on. Next, we're going to talk about the crisis in Syria. International journalist Tara Kangarlou is in the studio today with us. And we also have on Skype Professor of Political Science at Angelo State University, Bruce Bechtol. They are here to explain the crisis and how other nations are getting involved.
You there, Bruce?
I'm there. How are you?
Hi.
Morning.
Doing well. Bruce, first, what are your thoughts on the UN report that links North Korea to the Syrian chemical weapons?
Well, my first thought on this was that's old news. It's very important news because there's several compelling things in there. But North Korea has been supporting Syria's chemical weapons program and other weapons programs, many other weapons programs, such as ballistic missiles, since the 1990s. The Syrian civil war is a boon for the military-industrial complex, such as it is in North Korea. They're making a lot of money off it, and they continue to ship the chemical weapons over, to have trainers over there to help them use them, and to ship over the platforms that they use for those chemical weapons. That is to say, ballistic missiles and 122 millimeter multiple rocket launchers. What I think is so compelling about the report for people who haven't been following this closely is between 2012 and 2017, there have been more than 40 shipments of all kinds of military gear, including chemical weapons and associated stuff like that, for lack of a better term. So I think that this is going to get a lot more attention to an issue that's very important for the national security of the United States and for the Middle Eastern region as well.
Yeah, well, Bruce, the difficulty with North Korea is we in the Western world, we know very little about that country. We don't know what channels it has, and so on and so forth. And while you said this is not a surprise to you, I'm sure this came as a surprise to a lot of people. Is there anything we could do better so we have this information earlier?
Absolutely. For one thing, we can actually use sanctions that are targeting the correct people, and B, that are enforced. That has been the problem with sanctions for the past 8 or 9 years, and in fact, even during the George Bush II administration. In other words, sanctions need to target that overseas financial network, that spider web of the crime-like family that is the Kim family regime in North Korea.
Sure. Well, and we just saw the most stringent package of sanctions passed last week. But I want to bring Tara into the conversation. Welcome. So I know you've been very concerned and you've been on the ground in the Middle East. So tell us, what have you seen in Syria and what does the world need to know about what's happening?
I think the first point I want to make is that I would agree with Bruce on the fact that this is not new news. You know, this has been going on for a while now, and this March will mark the 8th anniversary of the Syrian crisis. And year, whether it's, it was in the Obama administration or now the Trump administration, we are seeing the use of chemical weapons, and this is not changing. And yes, there have been conversations around removing the arsenal and, essentially emptying Syria from sarin. But we saw what happened last April in Khan Sheikhoun. And the situation, Carrie, it's horrible. I mean, the humanitarian crisis inside Syria is mind-boggling. Just the past 2 weeks, hundreds of people have died in Ghouta, but unfortunately the numbers don't reflect that because there are no monitoring agencies on the ground tallying up the numbers. And I just really want to make this point that from about 4 years ago, the United Nations stopped counting the death toll in Syria. So
Was
you
it
can
just
imagine.
logistically too difficult?
Logistically, it was too difficult, so they don't have a presence on the ground. There is no monitoring presence in Syria, and that just makes everything complicated. And today, this afternoon, Britain requests a special hearing in Geneva because they are desperately trying to get aid on the ground. But again, that's up in the air because that has to go through the Assad regime's clearance. So we'll see.
Very complicated.
Very complicated.
What would you say this means? Sorry. What would you say this means for the rest of the world then?
I mean, the rest of the world needs to stand up because we've seen catastrophes like this in history. We had World War II, we had Kosovo, and years later, world leaders came together and said, we shouldn't repeat this. We should not see this again. But this is happening inside Syria, and there is no leadership in mitigating and stopping the bloodshed.
So, Bruce, I want to ask you about specifically the Russian angle here, because it appears both the Iranians and the Russians are propping up the Assad regime. And just there was 200 contract soldiers, mostly Russians, fighting on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, in the Syrian leader, and the U.S. killed them. They were, basically mercenaries who were defending the Kurdish forces. And so the U.S. Defended the Kurdish forces. And basically this clash has been described as the biggest clash between U.S. and Russian forces since the Cold War. Talk about Russia's involvement in Syria. And is this basically turning out to be a proxy war between the United States, Iran, and Russia?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the key thing here is to understand that the government of Assad would not be in power if it weren't for outside powers. That includes Iran, it includes Russia, which is very concerned about their naval base there. They don't want to see that go away. And obviously it includes North Korea, which, by the way, is not doing this as part of an aid project. They're getting paid for this, and they're making hundreds of $millions a year at least off of this. Russia is working right now closely with the Iranians. From what I'm told, I was in Israel last year, and at the time, a friend of mine who was doing research on just this project was telling me that the Russians and the Iranians were working very close together. They were trying to, in every way they could, tone down any perception about their relationship with the North Koreans. So that explains part of why we're not seeing a lot of this publicized by about North Korea until now. I don't think the Russians are going to be leaving there anytime soon because the civil war continues to go on. And again, I think the Russians feel that this is one of their strategic outposts in the Middle East. So for them, this is a strategic war, and they're going to do what they have to do to help that Assad government remain propped up along with their key allies, the Iranians.
Sure. And so the Iranians, Tara, I know you have an Iranian background, expertise. What about that? And Bruce mentioned Israel. There was Iranian drones that entered Israeli airspace from Syria and was shot down. And then in response, the Israelis flew a fighter jet, which was attacked. So again, this seems to be a proxy situation. And to have, an Iranian product or drone entering Israeli airspace, that could be perceived as an act of war, could it not? And is this just again, a proxy for the Iranians who have said very publicly they want to wipe Israel off the map?
I think to Bruce's point, this is a very complicated situation where you have different actors and different players playing inside Syria for their very individual and unique interests, whether Russia's interest, Iranian interest, the Gulf countries' interest, Israel interest, everybody's fighting, and they're creating essentially this mess inside Syria. And let's not forget the Turks, who are also fighting for their own security, fighting the Kurds. So with that said, this is a dynamic where Israel and Iran, strong enemies and adversaries, are fighting a playground to fight in. Now, where that's going to go is very important. And what's happening right now, we saw many firsts, like you said, sending a drone into Israeli space, striking Iranian assets in Syria. These are some of the firsts that we have not seen. But I think there's a bigger story here. There's a bigger worry that Israel has, which takes us away from Syria. And that's what's going on in Lebanon. Iran's influence is growing very much strongly inside Lebanon, and Israel is pretty worried about that. And what happens inside Syria will determine that dynamic in the months or year or so to come. But one thing I want to mention is the Middle East is very weak because you have nation states that are not politically strong, and they are incredibly
and also not economically strong.
Right,
They haven't
exactly.
diversified their economies. They're
Right,
not a
politically
very
they're not strong.
interdependent- Yeah.
So individually they can't manage. That's why they're coming together in this volatile space and trying to not lose grip of their influence, because at the end of the day, that's what Iran is after, that's what Saudi Arabia is after, that's what Russia is after. They want influence and gaining their interests. So that's what's playing out.
And we have a comment from Lawrence Williams. He says, NK, North Korea, still has friends in China. That's a very good point. Do you think there's anything the U.S., the
And
UK...
he says the reason that the non-sanctions are
hasn't been
is
working.
because of the Chinese.
Yeah. Is there anything the U.S., UK, and all the countries meeting in Geneva today can do to leverage that?
I mean, I think the North Korea story would be very different than how U.S. and U.K. and everybody's dealing with the crisis in Syria. But it goes back to interests. China has a lot of interests. Russia has a lot of interests. So they have to evaluate what's more important to them. And unfortunately, it goes back to the first question, the humanitarian issue inside Syria has become incredibly politicized, and that's the danger, and the trauma of Syria becoming normalized. That's the issue.
Tara, thanks so much for bringing it to our attention. And Bruce, thank you for helping sort this out for us. We're going to put your book on screen, Bruce, that's going to be coming out just so folks can check it out. North Korean Military Proliferation in the Middle East and Africa, Enabling Violence and Instability. Bruce, thanks so much for joining us as well.
Yeah, thank you. And
Always a pleasure. I hope we can do it again, ladies.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah. And on a much lighter note, we have the hosts of Upright Citizens Brigade show Lasers in the Jungle with us this morning to talk about the use of politics in comedy. Now let's welcome.
So, yes, I mean,
Matt
isn't that
Little
great?
and
Like we
Karina
pivot
Yeah.
from
one thing to the
most-
other.
This is what I love about the show is that we can have the mix of the heaviest topics possible.
Make us laugh.
Yes, please.
I was a little
please.
depressed
Yes.
listening.
Speaking of proxy wars, welcome to Comedians.
I'm going to open with a game of Zip Zap Zob.
Yeah. Yes.
Tell us about your show.
Okay, well, it's a stand-up show primarily, but we've included sketch and songs and silliness and lightheartedness, and we really, with this particular show, have brought together just an amazing group of people who just want to have fun for 80 minutes.
Yeah. We like to think of it as a comedy party. You know what I mean? We want it to be something fun and inclusionary. Right now, there's a lot of sort of exclusionary elements, especially there's, a lot of divisiveness in entertainment right now. I think we can all agree about that. And we
Not
get...
just in entertainment and pretty much everything.
Wait, what?
No, it's true, and that's exactly we really wanted to, and it sort of organically happened, but with the goal in mind of just having an awesome show and bringing people together and bringing performers together, and the audience is much a part of our show as the comedians. So we include them in the show, and everyone just has fun. It's just it might be 70 minutes. I'm saying 80 minutes. I don't want to. No, it's just
Oh man! We got called to the carpet immediately. But yeah, it's a really fun show. We have a blast, and I think all three of us, Sean Crespo included, and our producer Carol Hartzell, we all come from a background where we do talk politics. We're very active and we try to stay, informed, but we also want to be able to go someplace where we can have fun. Comedy's supposed to be fun. You know, at least that's what I heard.
Yes. Well, let me ask you something. 'Cause
yeah.
You said from different backgrounds, as the resident Trump supporter at this table.
Sure.
Generally, not on all things, but do you guys have any conservatives? Because I think that's a big problem. When I watched like Jon Stewart, it was just leftist constantly. And sometimes it was good, but he wasn't an equal opportunist in how he would take his pot shots.
I feel like we're equal in our
I think that SNL, and to be fair, I think SNL does a much better job at going after everyone because there's just so much material.
I do. I mean, I wouldn't say politically speaking, it's all in our show. I mean,
it is
just
New
a
York, so
portion
you're gonna get a lot more liberal leaning comedians, especially in New York. But we've never said like, you know, oh, absolutely not, because your views are, unless you want to get on stage and are just like inciting violence from either side, like whatever that is, then
like I had a joke about Triscuits they had a problem about, but anything else.
We talked about this, Katina. No, it is not a cracker.
I'm just really curious, how many conservative comedians / actors are there in New York?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, I think that the idea of, I'm so sorry, I feel like I just talked over you.
I'm used to it. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead. Go ahead.
For me to hide under this desk. Perfect. I think that there are probably less conservative entertainers, comedians, etc. And sometimes I wonder if that is because a lot of comedy and a lot of the best comedy is punching upwards or speaking truth to power. And I think that right now with a largely, GOP controlled
Washington.
Congress and government, you wind up speaking to that, trying to punch upwards from a different viewpoint.
That's a fair point, and I've made that point before. However, there were 8 years previously of not that. So
sure.
But I guess here's the question. Do you think, so like Jimmy Kimmel, for example, where he's become very political, do you think he risks alienating part of his audience? I mean, do you guys think about that?
I feel like if you're funny and you're passionate and you're really bringing something that you feel really passionate about, I feel like there's always success in that. And no matter what we say on our show, if you're entertaining people, the bottom line is if it's funny, it works.
Yeah, I think that it's all about finding out how to. You have to know how to speak to people, right? You have to know how to talk to people in a way that engages them with what you want to talk to them about, and not in a way that's just yelling at them. No matter what your point is, right? Like no one, even if it's something cool, you don't want to walk into a room and someone goes, "Hey, I've got an amazing sale for you. You're gonna look great in this sweater."
You sound like a WWF wrestler.
Yeah, let me tell you something, brother.
I mean, that is how we do our comedy, but no, I'm kidding. But I feel like if you came to our show, I didn't mean to interrupt you, if you came to our show, you would have the best time.
Yeah.
You would just say, you know what, this is...
Sure. Well, funny enough, my sister actually has done UCB training.
Yeah.
So,
oh, that's amazing.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So she also did Pitt, the People's Improv Theater. If you don't know about UCB, they're legend here in terms of being a farm team for a lot of the talent that goes on to the big leagues.
Amy Poehler.
So it's similar to the Windy City in Chicago. But who's someone politically that you'd like to portray, both of you?
Oh, that's
man.
a great question.
If you get cast on...
Yes.
What would you want to do? Dream.
Gosh. I don't know. Who would you say?
I feel like you would do a great Sarah. Look at me talking into this.
I was going to say
Really?
I was say
because of my hair.
Yeah.
You got the bangs.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I would. I mean, he's not in the media cycle anymore, but there was something always so funny about John Boehner.
Yeah.
I used to love that
You
sort of.
already got the suit right there. You got the
He
hair.
cries all the time.
Stop telling the
Only thing you need to do is to go to a tanning bed immediately.
Yeah. I have to exchange my regular bed for a tanning bed, and then it'll be perfect.
I almost see you as a young Rince Priebus.
Oh, I can do that. Yeah.
I love that.
We did a bit when Anthony Scaramucci became the White House press secretary, and we We were so excited because I felt like, oh, this could be a character that we could keep going with. And it was the next day that he was released. We were like, no!
No, well, Mooch has sat in that very chair, actually.
Oh!
I don't know which one of those.
I've been mooched. I've been mooched.
That's funny you say that.
Mooched by an angel.
All right, you need to take classes.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
That's also the funny thing is like you, especially now, you have to keep up immediately. I mean, as soon as we write a new joke and we think it's fantastic, somebody sends out a tweet and changes the whole spectrum.
Yeah, well, and President Trump just tweeted about Alec Baldwin and how he didn't like him portraying him, and that he thought that they got to bring his predecessor back.
Daryl Hammond?
Yeah,
Daryl Hammond.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tweeted about Daryl Hammond. So, yeah.
That was a sponsored tweet. Daryl Hammond.
Yeah, no, I just think, but when you guys do, because I know there's a big difference between stand-up versus like a, Jerry Seinfeld is a stand-up guy.
Sure.
You guys do improv. Do you do both? Are you that versatile?
Well, we actually are a stand-up show. And we incorporate elements of like improv and sketch and stuff in the show. So, Katina, some weeks it will be Katina and I hosting, and we're just doing stand-up all night in between comedians. Other times it'll be Sean and Katina on stage, and then for example last night Sean and Katina were hosting the show, and then I would interrupt with characters like absentee father Christmas, who was a Santa Claus that shows up late for his son's Christmas.
Nice.
And
Well, we got a fan here. Carol Hartzell says, "Yay, love Matt and Katina." So we love you guys too.
Thank
We're
you.
glad to
We
have
love
you.
you.
Here.
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh,
please.
please.
Check it out.
Come hang out.
Yes,
Matt
for
will put you
sure.
on the list, and no, I'm
Yeah.
kidding.
Yeah. Oh, there's a secret list. Yeah.
All right, Lasers in the Jungle. Make sure to check it out.
you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
All right.
Thank you so much for
Katina and
coming
Matt.
on.
All right, and to wrap the show, we are excited for our Bookster segment. As you all know who watch the show, Bookster is a website for book lovers and much more. Today we have author and Pulitzer Prize winner David K. Johnston here on Skype with us. His book is called It's Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America, and it's out now. David is a reporter that has been following President Trump since 1988. His unique insight into the inner workings of our commander-in-chief gives us access into what's happening. So, you there, David?
Hey, David.
I sure am.
Hey. So here, a lot have happened since Trump became a political figure. But I gotta ask you, what was the moment that you said to yourself, I have to write this book?
Well, was when he won the Electoral College. When he announced in June of 2015, I immediately realized that my peers were probably not going to understand who he is and how to cover him, and they didn't. The campaign coverage was god-awful. So I wrote The Making of Donald Trump. And I also told a number of people, he just might get it. You need to treat him seriously. And of course, in the beginning, he was treated as a joke. As soon as the Electoral College announcements was made on election night, that's when I said we had to do two things. We had to start some kind of a news organization to cover what he does, which is dcreport.org. And I've got to write a book that will document what's happening to our government, because journalists are doing a great job of covering the White House, and the government hardly at all.
So, David, as someone who supports a lot of what Trump is doing, again, not all, but a lot of it, you talk about stalking the swamp in your book, where you say that he's filling his cabinet with millionaires and billionaires, as Bernie would say. By my view is that I want successful people to run the country. I want people who know how to run a business, who have taken that hero's journey of being an entrepreneur. I want competent individuals to run my government. And in fact, people who have a lot of experience in government sometimes are so seeped, and at the very least, can you agree with me that having a fresh pair of eyes can often be beneficial?
Well, sure, Carrie, but there's nothing in my book questioning people's appointments based on their wealth. That's completely at odds with my work, which promotes competitive markets and exposes corporate socialism. But Donald Trump has put into our government utterly incompetent and unqualified people. If you read what I quote from a television appearance Wilbur Ross said that displays his utter incompetence, Betsy DeVos, who's experience dealing with charter schools in Detroit is so bad that people in the charter school movement, if you call them and want to bring up Detroit, immediately want to change subjects and go to somewhere else. The way that Scott Pruitt has taken the side of the polluters against the public, which means that right now some of the people watching this show are alive because Richard Nixon signed the Clean Air and the Clean Water Acts that the Trump administration is undoing. Donald Trump has loosed into our government political termites, and they are eating away at the structure of our government and its ability to do what we created it for. And we will pay a terrible, terrible price for this. And this is stuff that either has not been in the news or has been there only minimally, which is why I wrote It's Even Worse Than You Think.
So, David, I got to ask you, though, to what you're saying on the environment. The Wall Street Journal ran a very interesting op-ed from Walter Russell Mead, who is, I think, a very thoughtful and well-known foreign policy analyst and geopolitical analyst. And he says that basically what's happening in terms of the shale revolution and what we're doing to become competitively, pushing back against Middle East dependence on foreign oil. This is a geostrategic advantage, as well as the Russians. And by allowing American markets to be free and liberated in terms of oil and energy, we're able to help push back against the Russian influence on Europe. So in many respects, we're creating a stronger NATO by having a stronger and more robust energy policy, which saves many lives. So what would you say in response to that?
Well, Carrie, the ability to extract what's called tight oil, which we've known is there but couldn't get to, has been a great economic benefit to the United States. But that's not relevant to the points I make in the book. There's a huge difference between saying we want to use technologies that will make us energy independent and help us get off in the long run fossil fuels, and what the Trump administration is doing. I detail from people inside the government how what they're doing is helping polluters. And what is pollution? It's where a company externalizes its costs. So instead of cleaning up its own mess, instead it forces us to pay the costs for that in terms of heart disease, asthma, cancer. I'm sure you wouldn't argue, Carrie, that we should go back to the era when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland regularly caught fire for 100 years because of the carbons that were dumped into it by oil. Of course.
Well, and yes, as you said, it was Richard Nixon, a Republican, who signed that. And I also agree with you that crony capitalism is certainly not something that I'm okay with. Julie's got a question for you.
Oh, yeah, really quick, since you've been following Trump for 30 years, right?
Right.
Did he want to be president in the first place? I always want to ask people that. And now we're looking ahead to 2020. Do you think he's going to win a second term?
Donald might get a second term. Discounting that would be a serious mistake by everybody, particularly because the Democrats have not articulated what their economic policy is, but they've articulated very well how much they dislike Trump, and with good reason. Donald has been talking about being president since 1985. He believes he's genetically superior to the rest of us. He believes in his own mind he's the smartest guy in the world. I quote some of his utterly ridiculous statements and show how they're ridiculous in the book. But yes, Donald wanted to be president. He just didn't expect to win. And Donald Trump, I show, is the greatest con artist in the history of the world. I'll give you one little example. I'm a world-recognized expert on taxes. Donald says he is the greatest expert of all time, I quote his exact words in the book, on taxes. But he's testified under oath he knows nothing about accounting. Well, that would be the equivalent of my saying I am the world's greatest airplane designer. Julia, what's a wing?
Well, I think that Trump supporters would say that President Trump is a master communicator, and he understands the moment in time that he was pushing back against the establishment, and that he was brilliant for how he was able to basically push back against this enormous wall of opposition, not only in his own party, but in the left as well.
Carrie, do you know where he got his economic policy? It came out of my trilogy. Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and The Fine Print, which were about the need to drain the swamp and about how Washington was subtly redistributing money upward. And I documented all this from the public record. And I know that Donald watched me on TV. And his economic message, not his racial message, but his economic message, comes right out of my journalism.
All right. Well, we will let our viewers check that out then, because I think that's interesting. David K. Johnston, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us here on Facebook and Periscope. Don't forget to like Bold TV on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat. Keep the conversation going. If you like the show, share it with your friends.
And I hope all of you will stick around for our second episode of the day, Bold Life, at noon today. And also, please join us next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern for your weekly episode of Bold Business. I'll be here again. And also next Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern time for Bold TV.
Bye, everybody. Great weekend. Have a good weekend.